Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Ava Jerome entered Alexis Davis's house with her chest heaving from the weight of her own fury, her eyes sharp and burning with anger as soon as she saw Rick Lansing standing there. Every line of tension between them, every ounce of animosity that had been building over years of deception and betrayal, suddenly found its breaking point in that confined room. The walls seemed to close in, trapping all three souls inside, Ava, Rick, and an unsuspecting Christina Corinthos Davis, who had not planned to become part of this storm. At first Christina lingered in the background, trying to gauge the situation, unaware that the seconds ticking forward were about to tie her irrevocably to an act of violence that would alter every life in that room. Rick, brimming with arrogance, stood with that familiar smirk that had undone so many people before. He wielded his words like weapons, throwing barbed insults that dug deep into wounds Ava had long tried to hide. Each phrase was sharpened to humiliate, to break down her defenses, to remind her of every mistake and vulnerability she carried. He reminded her of betrayals, of secrets buried but never forgotten, and in doing so, he pulled forth a rage so profound that Ava could no longer keep it locked away. Her breathing became shallow, her pulse erratic, and her thoughts narrowed into one primal instinct: silence him before he could do any more damage. The room felt suffocating, and the dim lighting gave an almost funereal quality to the confrontation, as though fate had already decided that death would leave its mark here. In a blind surge of fury, Ava's eyes fell upon a decorative steel orb at the base of Alexis' table. It was cold, heavy, and merciless, exactly what her heart had become in that instant. Without a word, she seized it and swung with brutal force. The sound of metal colliding with flesh cracked through the silence, followed by the dull thud of Rick's body hitting the ground. The orb rolled a short distance before coming to rest, as if mocking the finality of what had just occurred. Rick lay still, his body crumpled unnaturally, a bruise forming across the back of his neck where the blow had landed. The air turned thick, almost unbreathable. For a moment, there was no sound, only the echo of violence reverberating in Christina's mind. Christina froze where she stood, her body trembling, her mind frantically trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. Her wide eyes were locked on Rick's motionless form, and she felt her pulse hammer against her temples. She had come into this house with no intention of being dragged into anyone else's vendetta, but now she realized she was no longer a bystander. She had become a witness to an act that could not be undone, a secret so heavy it would bind her to Ava whether she wanted it or not. Guilt, fear, and disbelief tangled within her until she could scarcely breathe. In that moment, she understood that fate had forced her into complicity, and whatever path lay ahead, it would be drenched in blood and shadow. Ava, on the other hand, stood over Rick with a frightening calmness beginning to replace her fury. Her chest still rose and fell quickly, but her eyes no longer burned with anger, instead, they gleamed with cold calculation. She knew panic would destroy her, and so she fought to stay composed. With Rick incapacitated, her attention turned immediately to Christina. She saw the young woman's terror, the horror etched across her face, and she recognized an opportunity. Christina was a liability, yes, but also a pawn, someone whose own sins could be turned against her. Ava remembered vividly the whispers, the rumors, the reckless act of Christina cutting the brakes on Rick's car months earlier. That truth alone was enough to lock Christina in her web, ensuring her silence and perhaps her obedience. The tension between them became palpable. Christina wanted to scream, to run, to call for help, but Ava's piercing gaze held her captive. In those eyes Christina saw not only menace, but knowledge of her darkest deed. And that knowledge was a blade Ava could wield at any moment. Christina's thoughts spiraled in panic. If she spoke, Ava would expose her. If she stayed silent, she was complicit. Either way, she was trapped. She felt the walls of Alexis' house pressing inward, suffocating her with guilt and dread. The gravity of what had just happened pulled her deeper into the shadows, binding her to Ava in a pact neither of them had agreed upon but both understood. Rick's faint, uneven breathing filled the silence for a brief moment, reminding them that he was not yet gone. But his condition was dire, his consciousness slipping. Christina's instinct was to rush to his side, to call for an ambulance, but Ava's sharp voice in her mind, calm, commanding, though never spoken aloud, warned her that helping Rick meant destroying herself. The man on the ground had been her enemy, her mistake, her guilt, and now he was her prison. She clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms, tears threatening to fall, but she refused to break in front of Ava. Deep down, she knew Ava was right about one thing: no matter what happened next, Christina was forever bound to this nightmarish moment. In that single act of violence, Ava had not only struck down Rick but had also ensnared Christina. The two women, once bitter enemies, were now chained together by secrecy, blackmail, and the shared burden of blood. And though Rick's body lay still, his presence loomed larger than ever, a ghost destined to haunt their every move. Somewhere beyond the walls of that house, life in Port Charles continued unsuspectingly. But inside, destiny had shifted, and a new storm was brewing, one that would consume Ava, Christina, and anyone who dared to come too close to the truth. Rick's body remained unervingly still on the floor, his breaths shallow and ragged, as though each one could be his last. The dim light from Alexis's living room lamp cast long shadows across his face, turning his features into a grotesque mask of defeat. His once confident and venomous expression was replaced with a slack, pale visage that spoke of a man teetering on the edge of death. The metallic scent of cold steel from the ornament Ava had used to strike him still lingered in the air, mingling with the growing staleness of silence that filled the room. Each passing second deepened the dread that clung to the walls, suffocating everything inside. Christina stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall as though she needed it to hold her upright. Her body trembled violently, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Her wide eyes refused to leave Rick's body, as if doing so might make her complicit in erasing his existence. Guilt consumed her, twisting in her chest like a blade. She knew that Ava had crossed a line that could never be undone, yet she also understood that in Ava's hands lay her own most damning secret. The very thought of that night, her reckless sabotage of Rick's car brakes, flooded her mind. She could still hear the screech of metal, the crunch of impact, and the horrifying moment Elizabeth Baldwin's life had hung by a thread. Ava had not only witnessed her terror that night but had stored it away like a venomous serpent waiting for the right moment to strike. Now Ava's calm, predatory stare locked on her, and Christina felt herself tightening inside a trap that she hadn't even realized had been laid. Ava's composure was chilling. Where Christina was unraveling, Ava was becoming sharper, more deliberate, more dangerous. She did not look at Rick with remorse or hesitation. Instead, her eyes calculated what came next, what to say, what to do, what leverage to use. She knew this was not just about surviving Rick's collapse, but about reshaping the narrative of everyone in the room. Ava stepped closer to Christina, her movements deliberate, like a predator circling prey. Christina wanted to scream, to run, to collapse, but her body betrayed her, locking her in place. Ava reminded her, without even needing words, of the truth that already bound them. Christina was not innocent. She was not merely a shocked bystander. Her hands, too, were stained with Rick's blood. If Ava chose to expose her, if she decided to unleash the secret of the tampered brakes, Christina's life would disintegrate. Everything she held on to, her fragile sense of redemption, her family's already fractured trust, would crumble to dust. And then there was Alexis. The thought of her mother pierced her heart like a knife. Ava's threats reached further than her own sins. If Christina rebelled, Ava could destroy Alexis as well, by exposing the theft of Cassadine heirlooms. It was a dual noose tightening around her neck, and for the first time Christina realized just how completely Ava had her cornered. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by Rick's faint breathing. Every exhale seemed weaker, his chest barely rising. Christina's instincts screamed at her to help him, to grab a phone, to call an ambulance before it was too late. But Ava's unspoken command was stronger. With just a glance, Ava reminded her that saving Rick would not absolve her, it would expose her. Christina's hands curled into fists at her sides, her fingernails cutting into her palms until tiny crescents of pain grounded her in place. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to cry, not in front of Ava. To show weakness now would give Ava even more control. Far from this suffocating room, the world carried on, oblivious. Yet fate was already moving pieces on the board outside. At the Port Charles Pier, under the veil of night, Danny Morgan and Rocco Falconeri stumbled across a vision that would unravel everything. The water lapped gently against the wooden posts, but floating on its surface was a body, limp, pale, and grotesquely still. The children froze, their innocent evening shattered in an instant. The faint glow of a streetlight illuminated the outline of an arm bobbing on the surface, a ghastly hand reaching upward as though for help that would never come. Their horrified screams pierced the quiet, echoing across the docks and drawing the attention of those nearby. Within hours, whispers spread through Port Charles like wildfire. A body had been found at the pier. The rumors began almost immediately, Rick Lansing. His enemies were countless, his betrayals legendary, and for many, the thought of his demise sparked a dark satisfaction. But that satisfaction was fleeting, quickly replaced by suspicion and unease. Questions hung in the air. Who had done it, why now, and what secrets had Rick taken with him into the depths of the water? For Ava and Christina, the news was not a release from guilt but the tightening of a vice. If the body was Rick, they would both be implicated the moment anyone began pulling at the threads of what had happened earlier that night. If it wasn't Rick, if he had survived and somehow slipped away, then the nightmare was only beginning. A wounded Rick, armed with vengeance, would return with a fury unlike anything they had ever faced. Either way, they were ensnared. Christina's mind replayed the image of Rick lying motionless, the sound of that steel orb connecting with flesh, the way his body had crumpled. She felt her soul fracture under the weight of being both witness and accomplice. She had once promised herself that she would see Ava pay for her crimes, the death of Morgan, the chain of destruction that Ava left in her wake. But now, against every instinct, she was tethered to Ava, forced into silence. Her hatred and her fear coiled together, creating a toxic mix that threatened to consume her from within. Ava, meanwhile, allowed herself no such doubts. She had lived too long in the shadows, too accustomed to blood and betrayal, to let guilt derail her. Instead, she leaned into control. She knew the story they would tell if pressed, the lies they would weave, the faces they would wear. But she also knew that control was fragile. One crack, one misstep from Christina, could undo everything. And so she tightened her grip on her unwilling accomplice, ensuring that fear would keep her in line. The body at the pier was only the beginning. Port Charles was about to convulse with rumors, suspicions, and investigations. And while Rick's physical form might have been broken, his presence loomed larger than ever. He was the ghost that would haunt Ava and Christina, a reminder of the violence that had bound them together. The city had no idea what storm was about to break, but when it did, the waves would reach every corner of every family, and no one would emerge unscathed. The bond between Ava Jerome and Christina Corinthos Davis was never meant to exist. It was forged not through trust or affection, but through blood, lies, and the suffocating weight of shared guilt. Once, Christina had sworn that Ava would pay for every crime, every cruel act, every life destroyed in her wake. Yet fate had twisted the threads so cruelly that now she found herself standing side by side with the very woman she despised, both of them tethered by a secret so poisonous it could unravel not only their lives but the lives of everyone connected to them. The irony was unbearable. Hate had been their foundation, and now that very hate bound them tighter than any loyalty ever could. Ava understood this irony far too well. She had lived her life in shadows, weaving deception into survival, turning enemies into pawns when the opportunity presented itself. Christina was no different. The panic in the young woman's eyes, the tremor in her hands, the way her body stiffened under the weight of silence, these were weaknesses Ava could exploit. She had already done so by reminding Christina of the sabotage, the night she cut Rick Lansing's brakes and nearly killed Elizabeth Baldwin. That act, reckless and born of desperation, had transformed Kristina from victim to criminal. It was the chain Ava needed, a weapon sharper than any blade. With it, she could keep Kristina leashed, ensure her silence, and mold her into an unwilling accomplice. But Kristina was not made of the same steel as Ava. Every day since Rick's collapse, she felt the burden press harder against her chest. Her conscience gnawed at her, dragging her deeper into a pit of self-loathing. When she closed her eyes, she saw Rick's lifeless stare. When she opened them, she saw Ava's piercing gaze, reminding her that she would never escape. The guilt was corrosive. It eroded her spirit, hollowing her out from within. She lived each day in fear, not just of exposure, but of herself. How long before she broke and confessed everything, no matter the cost? How long before the weight of silence snapped her in two? The streets of Port Charles were already stirring. Danny Morgan and Rocco Falconeri's discovery of a body at the pier had ignited a wildfire of rumors. The whispers spread through Kelly's, through the hospital corridors, through the offices and back alleys. "It's Rick Lansing," people muttered, some with grim satisfaction, others with genuine fear. His list of enemies was long, his reputation darker than most. Few would mourn him, but everyone would wonder who had silenced him and why now. The police would not ignore this. The press would not ignore this. And in a town where secrets had a way of surfacing, the truth would eventually claw its way to the light. For Ava, the rumors were dangerous but manageable. She knew how to navigate suspicion, how to deflect blame, how to cloak herself in half-truths until no one could tell where the lies began. But she also knew that every secret left a trail, and Rick's fall would not stay buried forever. People would ask questions. People would look too closely. And Kristina's fragile state was a liability she could not fully control. The young woman's eyes betrayed her fear whenever someone asked an innocent question. Her hands shook when Molly mentioned Rick's name. Ava could see it all, and while she kept her exterior calm, inside she knew it was only a matter of time before Kristina cracked. Kristina, meanwhile, felt the walls closing in from every side. Alexis's watchful gaze, Sunny's suspicion, Molly's probing questions, all of them pressed against her, demanding answers she could not give. Her family, already fractured, would not survive this truth. If Ava revealed the Cassadine theft, Alexis would be destroyed. If Kristina admitted the brake line sabotage, she herself would be destroyed. And if the full scope of Rick's collapse ever came to light, both she and Ava would be dragged into the abyss together. Every day was a balancing act on a knife's edge, and Kristina could feel herself bleeding from the effort to remain upright. The cruelest twist was that Ava and Kristina both knew this arrangement could not last. Port Charles was too small, too full of watchful eyes and eager tongues. The truth was a ticking bomb, and neither of them knew when or where it would detonate. All it would take was one slip, one misplaced word, one witness they had not considered, one fragment of evidence overlooked in their panic, and the facade would shatter. The police would descend, families would fracture, and the Corinthos name would once again be dragged through the mud. And then there was Rick himself. Was he truly the body recovered at the pier? Or had he survived, broken and battered, waiting somewhere in silence, his memory clouded but his hatred intact? A man like Rick did not simply vanish. If he lived, he would return, and when he did, his wrath would fall on both Ava and Kristina with unrelenting fury. The uncertainty gnawed at them, each possibility as terrifying as the last. If Rick was dead, they were murderers. If Rick was alive, they were targets. Either way, there was no escape. Every night Kristina lay awake, listening to the silence of her room, imagining the echo of Rick's last breath. Every day Ava sharpened her composure, reminding herself that survival was a game of control, and she was determined to win. Together, they walked through Port Charles with invisible chains binding them, their every step watched by ghosts, their every breath poisoned by secrets. The story of Rick Lansing's fall was far from over. Whether through death or vengeance, he remained a presence haunting the city. And the secret that bound Ava and Christina would grow heavier with each passing day, its weight pressing down until one of them broke. When that moment came, and it would, the collapse would not be limited to them. It would spread outward, ripping through the Corinthos family, through Alexis, through Sonny, through everyone who thought themselves untouched. Port Charles stood on the edge of a reckoning. And when the storm finally broke, it would not cleanse, it would consume. The silence that followed Rick's collapse was louder than any scream. His shallow, rattling breaths filled the room in uneven intervals, each one threatening to be his last. The shadows in Alexis Davis's living room seemed to stretch and close in around Ava Jerome and Christina Corinthos Davis, as though the house itself bore witness to their crime. Ava's fingers still tingled from the force of the blow she had delivered with the steel orb, but she showed no tremor, no regret. Her face was pale yet composed, her eyes locked in cold calculation. She had been here before, standing over men broken by violence, and she knew what came next. Christina, however, was unraveling. Her back pressed against the wall, her chest heaving, she could barely comprehend what had happened. She wanted to run, to deny, to erase the memory of Rick's body on the floor, but the reality pinned her in place. She was not simply a bystander. Ava's reminder of her own sins, the night she sabotaged Rick's brakes, echoed in her ears until she could hardly distinguish memory from nightmare.